The studio lights burned bright, and the cameras cut straight to the stage. No pleasantries, no soft introductions, just tension so thick it was almost visible in the air. Piers Morgan leaned forward in his chair, smirking with that familiar smugness. You know, Denzel, Hollywood's biggest secret is that you people play the same tired cards: race, oppression, cultural struggle, and then call it art. Isn't that just cultural exploitation itself? The audience gasped, half in shock, half in anticipation. This wasn't going to be a polite exchange. Denzel Washington didn't even flinch. His voice cut through the noise with the calmness of a man who'd lived the truth. Cultural exploitation, he repeated, staring at Piers like a surgeon preparing for a difficult incision. You sit here, with your accent polished by privilege, making millions tearing down others, and dare to lecture me about culture? You've made a career selling outrage. What you're doing right now is the real exploitation. The crowd erupted, clapping and cheering. Piers' smirk faltered for just a moment, but he quickly regrouped, doubling down. You're dodging, Denzel. I'm talking about how black culture gets glamorized, packaged, and sold. And Hollywood makes people like you its mouthpiece. Denzel leaned forward now, his voice tightening, every syllable a hammer. Let's talk about exploitation, then. You've mocked Meghan Markle, you've twisted stories about immigrants, you've cashed in on stirring division. That's not journalism. That's cultural theft. You don't highlight differences, you profit off them. The audience roared again, louder, some standing, others chanting Denzel's name. Piers raised his hand to calm them but looked unsettled. Denzel didn't stop. You think culture is a costume you can put on and take off. For us, it's life. For us, it's history. And when you trivialize it, you insult every ancestor who fought for the dignity you turn into a headline. Piers opened his mouth to fire back, but for the first time, his words didn't come fast. The silence in that second was deafening. The debate had just begun, and already, Denzel had landed the first blow. Piers finally found his footing. He laced his fingers, chin high. Look, I'm allowed to ask hard questions. It's called free speech, he said, letting the words hang like a shield. If your industry keeps milking identity for awards, surely I'm permitted to call it out. Denzel's laugh was quiet, almost kind, and devastating. Free speech isn't free of accountability, he said. You don't ask hard questions, Piers. You package easy provocations and sell them as courage. There's a difference. A ripple of applause moved through the studio. Piers pressed on. So your films, your speeches, your interviews, none of it uses pain as currency? Come off it. Denzel didn't blink. Here's what currency looks like, he said, counting softly on his fingers. Union crews paid fairly. Apprentices from South LA getting first credits. After-school programs funded because we shot on location. Scholarships named for kids most of your panel shows only mention when it's time for a headline. He leaned in. That's not milking pain. That's investing it, so it pays future dividends to the people who lived it. The room went still, then erupted. Even a few crew members clapped from behind the cameras. Piers' smile returned, thinner now. Beautiful speech. But culture isn't your property either. Everyone borrows, from music, from fashion, from language. Borrowing without credit is stealing, Denzel said, voice low. Borrowing without humility is colonizing. Appreciation is an exchange. Appropriation is extraction. He pointed gently toward the audience. Folks at home know the difference because they feel the bill when it comes due. Piers spread his hands. And who gets to decide? You? The people who created it. The people who paid for it with history, Denzel answered. If your platform profits while theirs starves, you just answered your own question. Piers tried a pivot. So you're the moral referee now? No, Denzel said, sitting back, calm as a verdict. I'm a witness. The band leader raised an eyebrow. The floor manager froze mid-hand signal. And Piers, sensing control slipping, reached for the one move he believed always worked. "Then witness this," he said, sliding a tablet across the table. "Your own words." The screen glowed, and the temperature in the room dropped. The camera zoomed in as Piers tapped the tablet, spinning it toward Denzel with a dramatic flair. "Here," Piers announced triumphantly, "your own interview, 2 years ago. You said Hollywood awards can be political, that stories are cherry-picked for the sake of image. Isn't that exactly what I'm saying?" Gasps rippled across the studio. Piers leaned back, convinced he had scored his knockout punch. His trademark grin returned, smug and sharp. Denzel barely glanced at the tablet before lifting his eyes back to Piers. His voice was calm but carried a weight that seemed to press the air itself down. "Context is everything. I said political, as in power struggles inside the industry, yes. But I never said identity itself was a gimmick. Don't twist my words, Piers. You don't get to cut and paste my truth for your narrative." The crowd applauded hard, some rising to their feet. Piers shifted, but forced himself to smirk. "So the words are yours. People at home can see it. Maybe you just don't like being held accountable." That line was meant to sting. Instead, Denzel let silence build before delivering his reply like a hammer. "Accountability is when your words match your actions. I've put my money and my time where my mouth is. I've built opportunities. I've backed schools. I've funded scholarships. What about you, Piers? How many of the communities you mock have ever seen a dime of your paycheck?" The question landed like a thunderclap. The audience roared approval. Piers blinked, his jaw tightening as the chant "Denzel, Denzel" rolled through the studio. For a moment, Piers looked cornered, but his instinct for provocation kicked back in. He raised his voice to punch through the chants. "Fine, you want receipts? You talk about culture like you own it. But when you profit from it, when you take the roles, the fame, the fortune, aren't you just another part of the machine?" Denzel leaned forward, steady and unflinching. "Difference is, Piers, I didn't build the machine to strip culture bare. I walked into it carrying the weight of my people. I fought to change it from the inside. You just sit outside, throwing stones at windows you'll never have the courage to enter." The crowd exploded again. And for the first time that night, Piers' smirk was gone, replaced with a flicker of genuine unease. The battle was no longer about words, it was about who truly owned the narrative. And Denzel was making sure the answer was undeniable. Words, the chant of his name echoing through the studio like a rally cry. Piers straightened his papers, clearly rattled, but tried to recover his usual bravado. "You're dancing around the question, Denzel," he sneered. "Hollywood pays you millions while the communities you claim to defend remain stuck. Don't preach morality while cashing the checks." Denzel leaned back, his hands folded calmly, but his eyes carried steel. "I cash checks, yes," he said firmly. "But then I cash them again when I invest back into real people. Do you want names, Piers? Boys from Compton who now have careers behind the camera. Girls from the Bronx directing their first short films. Families in neighborhoods you've never stepped foot in getting opportunities because we brought productions there. You reduce that to dollars because you can't measure dignity." The audience erupted again, cheers mixing with shouts of agreement. Even the band in the corner exchanged impressed glances. Piers raised his voice to cut through the applause. "Fine words. But you're still benefiting from a broken system. And maybe, just maybe, you like it broken. Because it keeps you powerful." For a moment, Denzel's face hardened. He leaned forward, his voice low but resonant. "I don't need a broken system to stand tall. I come from a line of people who stood with nothing but faith and grit. The only thing broken here is your mirror, Piers, because when you look into it, you don't see journalism, you see exploitation." The line landed like a thunderbolt. The audience gasped, then clapped in unison. A woman in the front row stood up, yelling, "Tell him, Denzel." Piers, visibly irritated, tried one last pivot. "So, you're untouchable? You're the saint of Hollywood? Denzel shook his head slowly. No. I'm not untouchable. But I am unbought. And that's why you can't stand me. You want to own the narrative. I just want to tell the truth. The studio roared, and the camera caught Piers swallowing hard before forcing a thin smile. For once, his trademark smirk wasn't enough to cover the blow he had just taken. The lights above the stage seemed to glow hotter, as if the entire studio was feeding off the tension. Piers leaned forward, elbows on the desk, his voice sharp enough to slice through the air. You say you're unbought, but Hollywood has owned you for decades. Every red carpet, every award show, you show up, you play their game, and you profit. Don't tell me you're some independent crusader. You're just another cog in the wheel. Denzel's eyes narrowed. He let the word sit for a beat, then leaned in himself, matching Piers' intensity. You want to talk about wheels? His tone was measured, deliberate, but carried a force that filled the room. The wheel I turn lifts people with me. That's the difference. I don't just roll over communities, leaving them crushed beneath. I open doors, I pull chairs to the table. That's not Hollywood owning me, that's me bending it to something bigger than its own greed. Applause surged, a wave of sound crashing over Piers' desk. He tried to talk over it, his British accent cutting hard. And yet, you still take the roles, the prestige, the money. You're still part of the system you criticize. Denzel slammed his hand softly but firmly on the table, the sound echoing like a gavel. I'm part of it, yes. But I'm not blind to it. There's a difference between surviving the storm and pretending it's not raining. I survived it, and I'm teaching others how to build umbrellas. The crowd erupted in laughter and cheers, some even stomping their feet. The metaphor cut through Piers' argument like a blade. His face reddened under the lights. Clever words, Piers spat. But words don't change the fact that Hollywood eats its own. And you've dined well at that table. Denzel leaned back, calm returning to his face, his voice lowering to almost a whisper. I've dined, yes. But I've also paid the check. And unlike you, Piers, I never walked out of the restaurant pretending I owned the place. The audience exploded, this time the ovation lasted long enough to force the production team to hold the broadcast feed. Even the stagehands behind the cameras clapped. And Piers Morgan, usually unshakable, looked like a man who had just been cornered with no clean way out. The chants of Denzel. Denzel rolled through the studio, shaking the walls. Piers sat stiffly, gripping his pen so tightly it looked like it might snap. He leaned forward with forced calm, his tone dripping with sarcasm. So, you're the savior now? The moral compass of America? Spare me, Denzel. The truth is, you thrive because the machine lets you. Without it, you're nothing more than an actor with speeches. The audience hissed at the jab, but Denzel didn't flinch. He turned slowly, locking eyes with Piers. His reply was controlled, almost quiet, but each word landed like a hammer. You mistake endurance for permission. I don't thrive because the machine lets me. I thrive because I refuse to let it define me. I've been underestimated since the first time I stepped on a stage. I've been told I was too loud, too black, too serious, too political. And yet, here I stand, because every wall built to stop me, I turned into a foundation. The crowd roared, some standing and clapping in rhythm. Piers smirked, but sweat glistened on his forehead. That's inspiring rhetoric, he said, rolling his eyes. But it's also self-serving. You talk about walls and foundations, but you still accept their awards, their applause, their money. If you were truly above it, you'd walk away. Denzel leaned forward, voice rising now with sharp fire. Walk away? And leave the stage to voices like yours? No, Piers. I stay because silence is surrender. I stay because young kids out there need to see someone who looks like them stand firm in places you say they don't belong. You call that self-serving? I call it responsibility. The audience erupted, a standing ovation breaking out. Even the band leader clapped his hands above his head. Piers' smirk faltered again. He leaned into the microphone, voice low and bitter. "So, you get to be the hero, and anyone who questions you is the villain?" Denzel's eyes narrowed, his voice slicing through the cheers. "No, Piers. Question me all you want. But when you twist culture into a punchline, when you turn people's identities into jokes, that's not journalism. That's cruelty dressed up as commentary. And cruelty has no place at this table." The room fell silent for half a second, then exploded louder than before, the audience's reaction drowning out even the stage monitors. For the first time all night, Piers Morgan had no comeback ready. The studio lights glared down, amplifying the silence that hung heavy after Denzel's last line. Piers adjusted his tie, forcing a chuckle into the microphone, but it came out strained. "Cruelty? You're really going to stand there and lecture me about cruelty, Denzel? You're part of an industry that parades morality when the cameras are on but hides corruption when the lights go out. Don't act like Hollywood is some sanctuary. It's a circus, and you're one of its star clowns." Gasps erupted, followed by a mixture of boos and stunned laughter. The remark cut deep, but Denzel's expression didn't break. He leaned in, the calm fire in his voice commanding every ear in the room. "If this is a circus, then you, Piers, are the man selling the cheap tickets outside. You don't build the tent. You don't tame the lions. You just profit off the noise. And when the show's over, you blame the performers for the mess you helped make." The crowd roared, some pointing directly at Piers with jeers. The host's face flushed crimson. He slammed his palm against the desk. "I profit off the truth. I expose hypocrisy. That's what I do." Denzel shot back instantly, his tone sharp as glass. "You don't expose hypocrisy, you exploit pain. You poke at wounds and call it journalism. You fan flames, then sell yourself as the firefighter. But let me tell you something, real truth doesn't need a hype man. It needs courage." The audience rose to their feet, clapping in unison, some chanting, "Truth! Truth!" Piers' trademark smirk returned for just a flicker, but it was strained, his eyes betraying frustration. He jabbed his finger toward Denzel. "Easy words when you're adored by millions. Easy words when you've had every door opened for you by Hollywood elites." Denzel shook his head slowly, voice dropping into a near growl. "Every door I walked through, I had to knock until my hands bled. And when they opened, I held them open for others. That's the difference, Piers. You see fame as a spotlight. I see it as a torch, and torches aren't meant to blind, they're meant to guide." The applause was deafening. Even the crew behind the cameras clapped, some nodding in agreement. Piers, cornered and visibly rattled, gripped his papers as if holding them together would somehow hold his argument together too. For the first time, the balance of control had clearly shifted, and the world was watching. The studio had transformed into an arena. Every camera angle captured the intensity, Denzel sitting tall, his eyes unwavering, while Piers fidgeted with his notes, the mask of composure slipping with each passing second. The audience leaned forward in their seats, hungry for what would come next. Piers tried to steady his voice, but it cracked slightly under pressure. "You speak of torches and courage, Denzel, but let's not pretend. You've played roles written by others. You deliver lines crafted for applause. How is that courage? That's performance, nothing more." The jab drew a murmur from the audience, but Denzel didn't blink. He leaned into the microphone, his baritone measured, deliberate. "Performance? You think it's performance when I choose roles that tell our stories? You think it's performance when I use my platform to shine light where others only see darkness? That's not acting, Piers. That's accountability. And accountability is something you run from every time you reduce culture to a soundbite." A wave of cheers thundered across the studio, drowning out the tail end of his words. Piers pressed on, trying to claw back control. Accountability? Don't preach to me about accountability when Hollywood covers up scandal after scandal. Your industry protects predators, yet you sit here lecturing me about truth. The audience gasped. For a moment, the room turned tense. Denzel leaned forward, his tone slicing the tension like a blade. And that's where you reveal your trick, Piers. You paint with the broadest brush possible, hoping people won't notice the cracks in your own canvas. Yes, Hollywood has shadows, but I've never hidden from them. I've spoken against them, stood against them. Can you say the same about the tabloids and platforms you've used to humiliate people just to boost ratings? The crowd erupted, this time with standing applause. Several audience members shouted, "That's right," while clapping furiously. Piers' lips curled into a tight smile, his eyes sharp with frustration. So you're flawless? Is that what you're telling America right now? That Denzel Washington has no sins, no contradictions? Denzel shook his head, his voice calm but booming. I'm not flawless. I'm human. But here's the difference, I don't weaponize my flaws against others. I don't turn people's struggles into clickbait headlines. That's your brand, Piers, not mine. The words hit like a gavel strike, final and echoing. The audience erupted once more, their cheers shaking the walls. Piers glanced at the cameras nervously, because he knew, in that moment, the viewers at home weren't cheering for him. The tension in the studio had reached its peak, the energy practically vibrating in the air. Piers, red-faced, leaned over his desk, his voice raised now, sharp and desperate. You're sanctimonious, Denzel. You stand here acting like some prophet of morality while hiding behind applause. Without this audience, without Hollywood's shield, you'd be nothing. Nothing. The outburst stunned the room into a brief silence. Then, slowly, the audience booed, a wave of disapproval that grew louder with each second. Some shouted back at Piers, their voices cutting through the noise, "Respect him," and "Sit down, Piers." Denzel didn't rise to the anger. Instead, he stood, calmly, deliberately. The camera panned upward as he towered above the desk, his presence commanding. When he spoke, his voice was low, but it carried the weight of thunder. You think applause defines me? You think validation comes from a crowd? No, Piers. Validation comes from legacy. From what you leave behind long after the lights go out. And here's the truth, you'll be remembered for the chaos you stirred, not the truths you told. The audience erupted in cheers, clapping and stomping their feet. Piers, visibly shaken, scrambled to push back. Legacy? What do you know about legacy? You're just another actor who delivers lines written by men braver than you. Denzel didn't flinch. He leaned across the desk, locking eyes with Piers so intensely that the room fell silent again. You're right, Piers. I deliver lines, but they're not written by men braver than me. They're written by men who needed a voice. And I chose to be that voice. That's courage. Courage isn't tearing people down with headlines, it's lifting people up with truth. The studio shook with applause. Some audience members stood on their chairs, fists raised, chanting Denzel's name. The moment was electric, beyond a debate, beyond a clash. It felt like history unfolding live. Piers sat back, sweat beading on his forehead, his papers scattered across the desk. For the first time, he had nothing to say. His smirk was gone, his confidence shattered. And Denzel, standing tall in the spotlight, let the silence hang. Because sometimes silence speaks louder than any retort. The camera zoomed in close, catching every flicker of expression across both men's faces. Piers stared down at his desk, shuffling papers that no longer mattered, trying to hide the defeat painted all over his features. The crowd knew it. The crew behind the cameras knew it. And most importantly, Denzel knew it. He stood tall, his frame steady, his voice unwavering as he leaned into the mic for the final word. You see, Piers, there's a difference between making noise and making change. You've built a career on noise, headlines, scandals, cheap shots. But when the noise fades, what's left? Empty words, broken people, a legacy of division. That's not journalism. That's not truth. That's exploitation. The audience erupted in a wave of applause, a chant breaking out, Denzel. 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 The sound was deafening, shaking the walls of the studio. Piers tried to interrupt, lifting his hand, but his voice was drowned out. He looked trapped, cornered in his own house, his authority evaporated in front of millions. Denzel raised a hand gently, quieting the crowd just enough to let his final strike land. His eyes locked on Piers, his words measured, deliberate. I don't stand here tonight to humiliate you, Piers. I stand here to remind people, truth isn't a commodity. Culture isn't your playground. And pain isn't your headline. You wanted to make this about me. But it's bigger than me. It's about every person who's been silenced, mocked, or exploited for profit. And tonight, they just saw what happens when you try to sell lies as truth. The audience exploded again, louder than ever. Some clapped until their hands turned red, others shouted praise, their voices merging into a roar that carried through the studio. The control room's monitors lit up with social media feeds, hashtags already trending, hashtag Denzel shuts down Piers and hashtag truth over noise. Piers leaned back, eyes darting to the cameras, desperate to salvage dignity, but there was nothing left to say. His signature smirk was gone, his trademark bluster dismantled piece by piece. And Denzel, calm as ever, simply stepped back from the mic, his presence enough to hold the room captive. The cameras caught one last shot, Piers silent, Denzel resolute, and the audience on its feet, chanting like a wave crashing over the studio. The broadcast cut to black, but the echoes of that night were already spreading across America, viral, unstoppable, unforgettable. This wasn't just a clash between two men. Tonight proved that truth cuts deeper than noise. Piers came armed with headlines and cheap shots, but Denzel answered with clarity, legacy, and courage. What the world saw tonight was simple: noise fades, but truth stands tall.